Shalom, Nariah. I will be taking notes this study.
Sure thing. All right, the study for today is Genesis chapter 2.
Great.
Verse 1 reads, Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Host means army. How do we know this? Well, according to Genesis chapter 21 and verse 32 it reads, Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up, and Phicol the chief captain of his host, and they returned into the land of the Philistines. Now we read the precept. Genesis chapter 26 and verse 26 reads, Then Abimelech went to him from Ger, and Ahazoth one of his friends, and Phicol the chief captain of his army. So we see here that host means army. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 2 says, And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. What is the seventh day? The seventh day is called the Sabbath day. It is also the last day of the 7-day week cycle. You can find the term Sabbath in Exodus chapter 16 and verse 26 which reads, 6 days ye shall gather it. But on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. This can also be found in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 10 which reads, But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. Let us also cover what it means to rest. To rest means to end all your work, which is also stated in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3 which says, And God blessed the seventh day, and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. It says there that God blessed the Sabbath. To bless, as we did in our last study, means to pronounce good. It also says that God sanctified the Sabbath. But how did God sanctify it? Yes, he did it by resting on that day. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4 These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. The term generation means year, or years. This is according to Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 7 which reads, Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations, as thy father, and he will show thee thy elders, and they will tell thee. Numbers chapter 32 and verse 13 says, And the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years, until all the generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was consumed. Precept, Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 14 which reads, And the space in which we came from Kadesh Barnea, until we were come over the Brook was 38 years. Until all the generation of the men of war were wasted out from among the host, as the Lord sware unto them. So we see with these examples that generation is known as years. Please also note that the term God was being used all along, but for some reason it switched to Lord God. Tell me why you think that is, in the comments. I did an entire search on that term and found some interesting things. See for yourself in 2 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 1 and 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and verse 1. Pause the video if you have to. Let's continue. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 5 it reads, And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew, for the Lord God had caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. So you're calling that, at that time of creation, 1. There was not rain, and 2. There was no man in the earth. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 6 says, But there went up a mist from the earth, and watered the whole face of the ground. What is mist? It is like fog. That's what watered the land at that time. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7 reads, The Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils of life, and man became a living soul. This of life is the same light that God created in Genesis 1, when he said, Let there be light. It says here that the way you become a living soul is by 2 things. 1. The breath of life, which is known as spirit, and 2. The body which God formed out of the dust of the ground. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 8 says, And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. Garden can also be known as land, according to Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 35 which says, And they shall say, This land that was desolate is become like the Garden of Eden. and the waste and desolate and ruined cities are become fenced, and are inhabited. Also see Joel chapter 2 and verse 3. Eden is also known as the garden of God as in Isaiah chapter 51 and verse 3. So to translate verse 8, and God planted a land in the east in a place called Eden, which is called the garden of God, and there he placed man whom he created. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 9 reads, And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So I looked at this verse and I said, if God already created trees and grass in chapter 1, why does he go on again to create more trees? Which metaphorically speaking the trees meant men, according to Mark chapter 8 and verse 24, which reads, And he looked up and said, I see men as trees, walking. Another example of this is Ezekiel chapter 31 and verse 9, which states, I have made him fair by the multitude of his branches, so that all the trees of Eden that were in the garden of God envied him. So I ask you, can a tree express envy? Let me know in the comments. Meanwhile, what does the term good for food mean? Well, according to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, it means to make one wise and pleasant to the eyes, and it states, And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her. And he did eat. So we see here that the trees that God formed out of the ground were men, that were pleasant to the eyes to make one wise, and also there were two men in particular, the men of life, and the man of the knowledge of good and evil. These two were in the middle of the land. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 10 reads, And a river went out of Eden to water the garden. And from thence it was parted, and became into four heads. So this is saying that a river went out of the land of Eden and watered all the land of Canaan, and the river parted into four heads or regions, as we see later on in the Bible in Moses' times, where Moses and Israel had to smite 7 nations to take the land of their inheritance, Canaan. We can find this in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 1, which says, When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than thou. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 11 says, The name of the first is Pison, that is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. Although we found nothing for the word Pison in the Bible, the clue given to us was Havilah. And it also specifically says that this was a land where there is gold and precious stones, in verse 12. So who is Havilah? Havilah is a son of Cush, and by extension a son of Ham. These were most likely the Egyptians, and the river Pison is a river of Egypt in those times. If you came up with anything to add to this verse, let me know in the comments. Since the river Gihon was lightly spoken of in the Bible also, I had to do further investigation to find out what or who an Ethiopian is. So basically an Ethiopian is a son of Keturah, and Abraham called Midian, or Midianites. How do we know this? Genesis chapter 25 and verses 1 and 2 states, Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bare him Zimran, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua. Exodus chapter 2 and verses 16 to 21 says, Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them, and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, How is it that ye are come so soon today? And they said, An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us, and watered the flock. And he said unto his daughters, And where is he? Why is it that ye have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter. So that man named Reuel was a Midianite. So his daughters would automatically be Midianite, right? Further down into the Bible we see that Zipporah, who Moses married, was Ethiopian. which is in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 1 that reads, And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. So we see here that Midian and Ethiopian is the same thing or person. Now according to Joshua chapter 13 and verse 21 which reads, And all the cities of the plain, and all the kingdom of Sihon, king of the Amorites, which reigned in Heshbon, whom Moses smote with the princes of Midian, Evi, and Rekem, and Zur, Enter, and Reba, which were dukes of Sihon, dwelling in the country. So it says here, that Midian or the Ethiopians dwelled in a place called Sihon, the land of the Amorites. And doesn't Sihon sound a lot like Gihon? Since we know, now that the river Gihon compasses the entire land of Midian, or Ethiopia, I looked at an atlas, to see whether that was true and saw, that the Nile River does, this which is also in Egypt. So Gihon could possibly be the Nile River. Now we move on to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 14 which says, And the name of the third river is Hiddekel, that is it which goes toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates. For Hiddekel there was minimum information except for Daniel chapter 10 and verse 4 which reads, And in the 24th day of the first month, as I was by this side of the great river, which is Hiddekel. Note here that Daniel was a part of the Persian government at that time, so evidently the Persians live or dwell there. And since the Babylonian government previously owned that place, these two rivers, Hiddekel and the Euphrates, belonged to the Chaldeans, which were later known as the Persians and the Medes, which took over the Babylonians. We will find this in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 30 to 31 which reads, In that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain. And Darius, the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The Medians, spoken about here is not to be confused with the Midian, or rather Ethiopians in the previous verses. So to wrap these verses up, the four rivers, from Egypt to the river Euphrates is, the entire land of Canaan, which God spoke to Abram about in Genesis chapter 15 and verses 18 to 21 where he says, In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates, the Canaanites, and the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Rephaims, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Now, Genesis 2 and verse 15 says, And the Lord God took the man, and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. So here we see that God put Adam in the land to do work. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 16 reads, And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayst freely eat. Here God is commanding Adam, saying, Of every man of the land you may freely take knowledge of. To eat means to take knowledge. How do we know this? It says here that God did not want Adam and his wife to take knowledge of the men that know good and evil. We see this in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 22 which says, And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil, and now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. Another example of this is in Ezekiel chapter 3 and verses 1 to 4 then skip to verse 10 it reads, 1. Moreover he said unto me, Son of man, eat that thou findest. Eat this roll, and go speak unto the house of Israel. 2. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat that roll. 3. And he said unto me, Son of man, cause thy belly to eat, and fill thy bowels with this roll that I give thee. Then did I eat it, and it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness. 4. And he said unto me, Son of man, go, get thee unto the house of Israel, and speak with my words unto them. Verse 10. Moreover he said unto me, Son of man, all my words that I shall speak unto thee receive in thine heart, and hear with thine ears. So we see here to eat means to receive knowledge. Now, Genesis chapter 2 and verse 17 reads, But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. So here Adam was commanded not to take knowledge of the men that know good and evil, for in the first 1,000 years that he does, so he shall die. 1 day is equivalent to 1,000 years to God. How do we know this? Well, according to 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8 it says, But, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. You can also look at a precept in Psalms chapter 90 and verse 4. Now let us see if what God said was true. Genesis chapter 5 and verses 4 to 5 reads, And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So we see here that Adam did die in the day, or rather before the day was up, when he had taken of the knowledge of good and evil. He was just shy of 70 years, to complete the day. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18 reads, And the Lord God said, It's not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him. Meat means good. How do we know this? Jeremiah chapter 26 and verse 14 says, As for me, behold, I am in your hand. Do with me as seemeth good and meet unto you. So here Adam was given the job to name everything that God created. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 20 And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him. So it says that Adam named all of God's creation, but Adam had no mate. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 21 And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh instead thereof. So here we see that God caused Adam to sleep and then took one of his rib out of him, then closed it back up again. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 22 And the rib, which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. So here we see that the woman was taken from out of man. We see that precept in the next verse. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 23 says, And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. So Adam named her as well. Just as 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 8 reads, For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 reads, Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. This is what marriage is. We can also see this in Mark chapter 10 and verses 7 to 9 which reads, For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and cleave to his wife. And they twain shall be one flesh, so then they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. You can also find this in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 5 to 6 and Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 31. Now we go to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 25 reads, And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Which means that Adam and Eve were blameless before God because they had not committed any sin although they were naked. This is the end of the study. Let me know what you think naked means in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Shalom.